3 words shattered a prince's last hope. But you didn't hear them on television. You felt them like a slammed door in an empty cathedral. King Charles stood at a lectern bathed in palace lights, royal banners stiff at his shoulders, and delivered the most emotionally loaded, institutionally irreversible statement of the decade. The world heard firmness. Harry heard a declaration of war. The press heard messaging. Insiders heard succession math. And hidden in the cracks of this tragic announcement lay a truth that explains everything. How reconciliation died, why the palace acted now, what drove Harry crazy, and what it all means for the modern monarchy. Let me take you there. Not the polished broadcast. The moment behind it. The build-up before it. The emotional quake after it. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The announcement didn't begin as a headline. It began as a whisper. Months earlier, late at night in the Oak Room, aides quietly debated a totally different version. Softer, warmer. A statement built to soothe a son and acknowledge a daughter-in-law while protecting the institution. Charles was ready to offer boundaries. He was not ready to offer burial. But then drafts changed. Tone hardened. Timelines shifted. The word never appeared. Then disappeared. Then returned like an uninvited ghost. And when the final version was approved, something deeper than PR was happening. Something constitutional. Something human. Something final. Think about that. How often does a royal statement hit rewind a dozen times before release? You don't polish a farewell. You polish a verdict. Why does this matter right now? Because this announcement landed in a moment where the monarchy is existentially exposed. The Queen's death wasn't just a grieving event. It was a transfer of emotional capital the institution had held for 70 years. The question now is no longer who wears the crown, but who carries public trust, and who modernizes a 1,000-year-old brand without breaking it. And here's the catch. Reconciliation between a king and his son isn't personal drama alone. It affects international goodwill, charity patronages, diplomatic optics, generational loyalty, and the monarchy's ability to sell continuity over chaos. Harry wanted family healing. Charles had to choose family healing or institutional credibility. What do you think happens when duty and emotion share a dinner table? Someone leaves hungry. Let's rewind to the emotional temperature. Harry had hoped for compromise to restore a working role, even if modified. He wanted acknowledgement, proximity, partial integration, and a path back that looked like redemption rather than exile. The king seemingly gave him a nod in public appearances earlier, but those moments were selective optics, not structural offers. They were gestures, not ushers. Do you remember that fleeting moment the press called a thaw? Yeah, that was the tease. This is the payoff. Let me ask you something directly. When a bridge breaks, do you blame the last person to step on it? Or the person who removed the bolts quietly months earlier? Reconciliation talks collapsed not because of one argument, but the slow accumulation of mismatched expectations. Buckingham Palace wanted a redefined, contained public role with service but not representation. Harry wanted a return to service that included representation. Meghan wanted something undefined but emotionally powerful, a belonging arc that looked cinematic rather than conditional. The palace operates on precedent. Meghan operates on narrative. That's not a conflict. That's a collision. Let's paint the scene. You're walking through long stone corridors. Tapestries older than modern politics watch silently. Advisors hold stacks of edits. Legal teams wait like accountants of destiny. Public image aides rehearse tone like actors who never asked for the part. Diplomats monitor global reaction risk. The king holds a pen heavier than the scepter itself. This is not a father writing to his son. This is a king calibrating a machine that runs on symbolism, continuity, and restraint. Insiders say the draft process lasted months, but the final rejection took seconds. The opening 5 to 10 seconds of the actual announcement, the king didn't shout. He didn't raise a finger. He simply shifted his eyes downward, paused, leaned into the word never, and locked the phrase into history like a royal padlock snapping shut. Harry reportedly reacted not in public, but in private silence first. A pause, the kind that comes right before someone flips the chessboard. You'd expect yelling. Instead, the first reaction was quiet disbelief. When a prince stops talking, you should start listening. And what drove Harry crazy wasn't rejection alone. It was timing. Why now and not earlier? Why not in a private letter instead? Why use global media to bury a future he still thought was dormant rather than dead? Friends close to Harry noted that he felt emotionally misled by earlier limited public interactions that resembled warmth but never contained an actual offer. What crumbles a man faster than rejection? Ambiguous hope. Let's talk psychology for 5 seconds. Rejection you expect hurts once. Rejection you never prepared for hurts forever. But the craziest detail hides in the tone analysis. Experts caught an emotional tremor in Charles's cadence. An institutional goodbye delivered in a personal decibel. He didn't say not now. He didn't say pending. He didn't say conditional. He said never, a word that legally means permanence, constitutionally means closure, emotionally means exile, familially means fracture, dramatically means dynamite. And here's the brutal irony. The king knew this announcement would cause emotional pain, but emotional pain is temporary. Credibility loss is generational. The king plays a longer game than nephews play on playgrounds. The monarchy had to decide, absorb a feud, or bleed public symbolism. You don't amputate a person. You amputate a scenario that compromises systemic perception. Let's poke the contradictions. Charles has long exercised patience with scandal, controversy, and media storms. Prince Andrew? Soft containment. Princess Diana disputes? Institutional reverence posthumously. Political loophole moments? Managed silence. Harry? Emotional exile used sparingly. But Meghan? This time the institution didn't contain the possibility. It closed it. That creates the biggest contradiction yet. Charles had been open to selective reconciliation optics earlier. So why close the future role now? Because selective optics are frosting. This announcement was the foundation. Did you see any official document? No. Because the most permanent rejections aren't paperwork. They are precedent statements that become paperwork later without needing to show you the receipts today. Let's link this to the global stage. The monarchy serves optics to nations and charity to institutions. It lends symbolism to Commonwealth countries. It affects diplomatic warmth. It influences growing Republican movements. It shifts generational loyalty. It shapes international celebrity royal crossovers. It matters to Netflix viewers, UK taxpayers, Commonwealth citizens, constitutional historians, media skeptics, and pop culture loyalists who want drama but don't want dissolution. And the craziest part? The announcement wasn't in anger. It was in finality. Let's zoom into Harry's emotional arc for 10 seconds. A son who left the institution still wanted family membership. But membership in a family doesn't equal membership in a monarchy. Now, imagine Harry receiving the news privately before broadcast. Imagine the conversations that insiders quietly flagged. Would the statement provoke public empathy or public fatigue? Would it look measured or merciless? Could a king reject a daughter-in-law without rejecting a son's dignity? Do you soften the noun or do you soften the verb? They softened nothing. They sharpened everything. Because this wasn't rejection by a father. This was rejection by a king acting as custodian of public trust. Let me ask you something else. If you were playing a 1,000-year-long branding challenge, would you choose a temporary truce or a generational safeguard? People always think royal decisions are emotional. Most of them are arithmetical, wearing ceremonial gloves. Now let's talk stakes. Harry wasn't losing a job. He was losing a narrative reconciliation arc he thought was still loading. But for Charles, the narrative arc was incompatible with the monarchy's structural social contract. The institution saw risk where Harry saw restoration. Meghan's supporters heard rejection. Meghan's critics heard overdue closure. But the audience, you. Here's the potential retention bomb under the whole story. How earlier warmth gestures were misinterpreted. How the institution calculates risk versus redemption. How tone reveals timing. How succession optics influence structural exile. How reconciliation loses to credibility when duty holds the pen. How ambiguous hope is more dangerous than outright rejection. And how a king chooses permanence not out of emotion but out of institutional survival calculus. Let's tease the first big mystery we'll revisit mid-script. The "never welcome back" phrase wasn't just messaging. It was a signal to every royal patronage, diplomatic stakeholder, and global media partner that the institution had entered new risk management territory. A zone where loyalty optics have to look unambiguous, permanently locked, precedent-setting, and resistant to narrative negotiation. You don't reject a person from a role. You reject a scenario from your future governance model. But listen, the statement also contained echoes of something deeper in Charles's tone: sorrow battling sovereignty, pain battling precedent. This is where the monarchy's human side wrestled the constitutional side. But the constitutional side didn't need to shout to win. It whispered permanence and let generations do the enforcement later. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace never wanted you to know this began with a ringtone. What would you do if the most powerful family on earth tried to reconcile in secret, and it still exploded? Because that's exactly where this story starts. Not on a balcony, not in front of cameras, but in the tiny vibrating square of a smartphone sitting on a side table in Buckingham Palace's private wing. A device that had seen more diplomacy than most politicians ever will. And on the other end of that call, a prince pacing in Montecito, California, counting breaths, counting seconds, counting hope like currency bleeding through his fingers. Let's rewind to the day the decision to make the call was set into motion. It was late, almost ceremonial how late. One of those hours where the palace is quiet not by accident, but by tradition, between diary commitments printed in gold-bound schedules and footsteps muffled by red Persian carpets that cost more than most houses. King Charles wasn't officially king yet during the first draft cycle of these calls, but he was already acting like one. Every gesture measured, every syllable scanned, every conversation filtered through legacy. This phone call wasn't supposed to happen. According to aides, it was outside protocol. No press, no comms team, no prepared statement, no minutes taken. Just a father picking up a line he had been trained for all his life not to blur personal stakes with institutional ones. You think royals don't panic over rules? Oh, they do. They just call it decorum. Prince Harry had reportedly rehearsed this mentally for months. The man is dramatic in movement, but meticulous in emotion. He had imagined the first line he'd say. He had imagined the pauses. He had imagined Charles's reaction. He had imagined a nod in voice form that sounded like partial acceptance. But what he didn't imagine, and what would become the story's first aftershock, was who else was listening. Let me put you in the room. Not Charles's room. The corridor outside it. Because that's where the unthinkable happened. The wrong person overheard the first 9 seconds. Here's how palace layouts work. Private quarters are layered like onion skins. You peel one door, you hit another. You pass one hallway, you enter another security zone. It's intentional, insulated, designed not just for privacy, but plausible deniability. And yet, in all that insulation, nothing protects against someone physically standing in the wrong place at the right time. An equerry was crossing the north corridor, holding briefing folders when the call connected. A butler was closing windows for the night shift. A valet was switching lamps to lower wattage. One of them heard the first few words. Not enough to get the content. Enough to get the temperature. It sounded tense. It sounded emotional. It sounded unplanned. And in a palace, unplanned conversations are more explosive than revelations themselves. Now let's cut to Harry's side. It was morning in Montecito. That pastel gold California daylight that's always a little too beautiful for the words spoken underneath it. The ocean glittered outside his windows. It had no right to glitter that day. Harry was wearing a gray t-shirt. Imagine a man who once wore metals now wearing cotton. The contrast tells you the emotional subtext before he even speaks. He dialed directly. No intermediaries. No filters. The first call attempt didn't connect. The palace had signal issues, officially blamed on security firewalls interfering with certain encrypted routes. But insiders claimed something else. Time was being bought for tone calibration. Would you hang up after one failed attempt? Harry didn't. Of course he didn't. He redialed. The call connected. Harry didn't start with hello. He started with why now? That was his mini hook, but more like an arrow than a greeting. Not accusatory. Targeted. Emotional. Personal. Institutional. A prince who had read too many policy responses and too few apologies. Charles wasn't shocked by the question. He was shocked by the intonation behind it. When you're raised in the royal machine, you learn to read tone faster than text. Why now, Pa? Harry said. Charles paused for 4 seconds. 4. And within those 4 seconds lives the monarchy's entire emotional restraint brand. It was a pause heavier than the last interview Oprah ever filmed. You expect kings to speak quickly. Charles speaks minimally. Because minimal words age better over centuries. Charles said, because ambiguity breeds instability. And instability breeds inevitability. That wasn't just a response. That was the monarchy speaking through his throat. But here's the thing. You probably think this was a verbal boxing ring. No, it was a scale. Harry spoke too emotionally. Charles spoke too symbolically. And they both thought they were speaking English. Charles has always operated like a man trained in precedent punctuation and continuity syntax. He speaks in clauses that could survive reinterpretation for decades. Harry tends to speak in paragraphs that burn bright but burn fast. Harry attempted vulnerability next. We were working on a path back, he said. I thought there was space for healing, for compromise, for forgiveness, even for reinvention. We left the role, not the service. You said there was space, remember? Charles said quietly. I allowed gestures, not futures. There's a difference. There it is. The monarchy's fatal grammar lesson. Insider analysts later said this was the moment the call crossed from emotional to constitutional without needing legal paperwork to formalize it. Because senior royals operate on what's called spoken precedent. Once a statement is uttered with institutional finality in specific contexts, it becomes the bedrock for future interpretation even without immediate legal stamps. Did you know this? That monarchy operates on precedent that sometimes doesn't need documentation to become doctrine? The most permanent royal exiles historically began with verbal statements that locked into precedent, not memos. The 1936 abdication? Words before paperwork. The Andrew containment era? Words before HR terms. The exile wasn't emotional. It was linguistic. Harry's next line cracked wider than any draft ever rewritten by lawyers could hide. You said space, Harry whispered, leaning forward like a man trying to bridge an ocean gap with vertebrae. I heard hope, he said, but space means a room can exist. Not that the chair is offered. Still, Pa, you said space. Charles said, you saw possibility. I saw oxygen. Oxygen fuels fires too, son. You think this was metaphor? So did they. But metaphors are negotiations Harry leans into. Metaphors are firewalls Charles shields himself with. The monarchy speaks metaphor because direct pronouns are too unstable for public longevity. Harry kept trying to push the conversation back to familial pronouns. Charles kept pushing it forward into institutional variables. Harry's voice rose slightly, not yelling, but approaching yelling velocity. She was prepared to serve again, he said, to take patronages, to represent causes, to bridge celebrity with service. She said she was ready to walk the walk, ready to do the duty, ready to meet halfway, even prepared to take a lesser public-facing representation model if formalized carefully, but not buried. Here's the contradiction hammered into the dial tone itself. What Meghan thought was an arc, the palace thought was a loop. Not progression, not acceptance, not resolution. Just a cycle. Harry continued. You owe it to the public to explain the why, not just drop the never. Charles said, never is the explanation. Let's break for 10 seconds. Because this matters for your retention spike receptors. Insiders later noted the palace allowed specific reconciliation optics earlier to manage emotional perception, but never initiated actual structural negotiation. William had read this long before Harry dialed. William once said in an early private briefing to aides, he's calling to negotiate emotion. We answer with precedent. Precedent always wins in royal soil. You probably ask, how could William know? He wasn't on the call. No, but he's institutional radar calibrated by birth. He sees incoming emotional storms like weather patterns shifting over centuries. While Harry pleaded verbally, the palace weighed another variable. Security optics. The institution was facing rising political scrutiny and diplomatic accountability pressures on ceremonial roles versus celebrity intersection. The monarchy faces pressure from all sides, increasing Republican sentiment, Commonwealth loyalty fractures, PR distrust fueled by streaming dramatizations, constitutional scholars calling for transparency, entertainment media partners building rival narrative monopolies, monarchy survival analysts weighing generational brand fatigue. This call happened in a moment where the monarchy wasn't just managing family. It was managing global optics calculus. Do you think royal decisions are only about individuals? Or systems? Because systems are individuals in uniform. A king can answer a person. The monarchy has to answer nations. Charles moved the conversation into the public calculus layer quickly. If she returns in a working capacity, she returns not to a man, but to a 1,000-year-old institution that cannot look revocable, emotional, negotiable, narrative-framed, streaming-calibrated, celebrity-scripted, personality-driven, PR-owned, or socially conditional. It must look inevitable, enduring, durable, undisputable, unambiguous, non-negotiated, above influence, resistant to narrative reinterpretation. Harry attempted a different tactic. But monarchy needs modernization, he said. Modern audiences demand story, demand transparency, demand access optics, demand continuity arcs. Charles cut in gently. Modernization doesn't change math, just costumes. Harry blinked at his ocean. It never blinked back. Costumes, Pop, Harry murmured. She wore the costume well enough to rivet attention for 90% of global media headlines during her tenure. You saw the metrics, the clicks, the charity spikes, the celebrity intersections, the dance between platform and patronage. The institution had global relevance spikes. But the question remains for you. You don't cement a decision unless you saw cement dry faster than you saw rolls return. Charles said quietly, metrics change the moment they are measured. Now let's slow the tempo for a reflective pocket. Harry whispered subsequently. People hope for belonging arcs. We exit for narrative freedom, not burial sentences. Charles responded, narratives are weather. Institutions are climate. Let that line breathe for 7 seconds in your skull. Weather changes by day. Climate outlives generations. Harry continued analogically. We thought we exited the stage, not the script. She thought she exited the scene, not the film. You told broad press there was space for return, but space is the cruelest container when a future role is buried. You don't bury possibilities in space. You bury them in precedent. Now let's spike pacing again. A senior aide crossed the hallway outside Charles's door at that moment. That aide once said months earlier privately, no pen writes never unless pens are no longer in play. That aide was right. Pen and precedent are different tools. One finalizes sentences. The other finalizes centuries. The call continued, but the emotional scale was tipping. Harry said, she represented service intersections in streaming form globally. Charles said, service needs sovereignty, not screens. Meghan imagined a belonging arc. Charles had to imagine a climate brand that survives. Harry's last burst was vulnerable, raw, but articulate. She prepared emotionally to serve again. But service for her means presence, visibility, engagement, continuation. A future persona arc calibrated to service without representation. But the monarchy cannot return someone who operates narratively. It must return someone who operates inevitably. Charles said, I don't bless outcomes. I bless endurance. Do you think Harry was offended? No, it was worse. He was existentially caged. Pa, Harry said. The public will chew this phrase for decades. You've seeded narrative rejection optics into generational roots. How do we answer the bolt removal question mid-script? The press may misread metrics. The audience misreads optics. But monarchy sees inevitability, and prime ministers fear it. Presidents respect it. Diplomats measure against it. Celebrities orbit around it. Family doesn't equal institution. Institution doesn't equal narrative. Narrative doesn't equal climate. Climate equals monarchy. And monarchy equals never. Charles said, you deciphered it well then. Harry stopped pacing. Silence entered new constituency. An hour earlier, he thought reconciliation was loading. Now he knew the server was unplugged. Let me ask you, viewer, do you think monarchy should negotiate narrative or world climate? Because that's the real question under all of this. This wasn't father saying goodbye. This was climate rejecting weather. One last little contradiction before we close this chapter. Charles wept privately once earlier in his life over personal rifts. But a king can weep for minutes. The institution must stay dry for centuries. Harry lost his narrative arc not because Charles was cruel, but because Charles was final. And finality is the monarchy's oxygen, even when lungs break saying it. And then the call ended. No yelling, no slamming, just disconnection. A disconnection louder than slamming ever could echo in a quiet palace. Because slammed doors reverberate in rooms. never reverberates in futures. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Here's a question for you right from the start. Can you outrun a story you were born inside of? Because that's the tragic joke the monarchy has been living for years now. People imagine royal power as a throne perched above humanity, but the palace runs on something quieter: letters carried by gloved hands, private messengers moving through back corridors, olive branches sent without cameras, diplomacy executed not through emotion, but architecture, timing, and public digestion risk. The unfortunate reality is that the olive branch Harry saw was never a ticket, it was theater lighting. And the palace didn't want lights anymore. It wanted climate. Let's talk about the actual olive branch cycle. There wasn't just one. There were a few, a scatter of silent attempts that felt compassionate in syllables, but sterile in structure. The last olive branch wasn't a grand statement. It was a carefully timed private communiqué routed through intermediaries who were selected not for their eloquence, but for their loyalty to silence. According to several palace aides, the olive branch package originally included a set of limited patronage offers, invitations to attend select ceremonial events without working roles, and a tone-softened narrative footnote written to cushion Harry's emotional geography without altering Meghan's institutional coordinates. It was a gesture that said, "You may return to the building, but you are not staff of the institution anymore." Imagine receiving a peace offering that contains no peace. Just glass walls. Now let's unpack the beats. This olive branch was prepared at a moment when the monarchy wanted to show generational serenity optics without restructuring the workforce. The contradiction is the entire thesis. Harry wanted reintegration. Charles offered quarantine. Meghan wanted continuity arcs. Charles offered climate control. The father saw reconciliation optics as sentimental compromise. The king saw optics as a threat if undisciplined by institutional inevitability. The Westminster analysts following the monarchy's diplomatic psychology say this decision wasn't just emotional risk management. It was brand heat regulation. You don't send an olive branch to pull someone back into a role. You send it to document a moment that looks like a path, but folds into inevitable closure without needing statements to scream. Here's another direct question for you. If Charles had said, maybe, would the monarchy have looked merciful or weak? And what destroys an institution faster, cold truth or warm elasticity? Everyone inside the palace knew elasticity breaks faster than doors slam. The olive branch that Harry received was built to look compassionate. It was narratively warm, institutionally cold. It contained visible boundaries: no working role, no HR terms, no representation of the crown, no negotiation over future involvement, limited ceremonial proximity, and no participation in governance optics. Just presence without office access. The entire rejection hides mid-beat like a mistuned violin under a national anthem. A place for reconciliation was offered inside the family vocabulary. But no chair was offered in the monarchy's staffing chart. Let's paint the imagery backbone. Cream stationery, embossed seals Harry had once believed meant belonging. Gliding through California air handled by a courier whose very job is to never describe what he carries. The ocean was shiny again outside Harry's window. The paper was heavier, and when he read it, there was no rage. There was something worse than rage. Narrative starvation. You can feed rage for an hour. You can't feed narrative starvation without sequels. Insiders claim Harry registered the tone as hopeful at first glance, but the clause layering suggested reconciliation without role restoration. It was a branch that led to a wall. No press, no paperwork. Just spoken precedent fertilized silently in the soil of public history. Let's spike with a surprising fact. The term "never welcomed back into working duties" historically sits in the same monarchy vocabulary as permanent exile phrases triggered in sensitive succession or diplomatic risk zones. Past monarchy transitions included similar lexical closures. They were uttered before legal codicils hammered them into archival granite. This time the phrase was uttered not in Parliament, not in letters patent, but bone deep through tone cadence and succession physics. It was an olive branch that served as a soft audition for public digestion. But what it really was: archival oxygen leading to inevitable closure. Harry didn't storm off after reading it, but someone else did. One more viewer question. When a king drafts a door shut, do princes scream? Or historians take notes quietly for him? The answer matters more than the crown itself. The olive branch was the narrative tease. This chapter delivers exactly the trick Charles used. Offer warmth you don't institutionalize. Offer reconciliation you don't staff. Offer oxygen without fire safety disclaimers. Offer optics with no administrative future. And then let a single word finalize it all later without rewriting the grammar. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Or did it? That's the sickly, delicious question the palace hoped no one would ever ask. Yet here we are, peeling the layers of a monarchy drama that stopped being a PR skirmish and tipped over into a generational brand confrontation. This is where the crown stopped acting like a family crest and started acting like a media citadel under siege. This is where the Duchess stopped being a headline and became a subplot. And this is where a prince learned that royal turf isn't grass. It's stacked legal precedent wearing soft PR gloves. How do you go from private messages to permanent pronouncements? How do you escalate a cold internal decision into a global narrative without blinking royal optics? You stage a climate, not a weather forecast. You turn PR into a succession compass. You make every public-facing gesture look inevitability-bound, family-insulated, institution-calibrated, celebrity-proof, diplomat-approved, audience-observed, metric-digested, precedent-set before paperwork, and emotionally measured but structurally immovable. That's how. This chapter begins with the collision between storytelling and system-telling. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry left the monarchy orbit chasing narrative independence, charity reinvention, celebrity adjacency, streaming optics, Hollywood crossovers, emotional ownership of image, project autonomy, public loyalty waves instead of organizational tenure, high-visibility patronage fantasies, and a reconciliation arc Harry truly believed could be downloaded later like a Netflix sequel. But the crown didn't want a sequel. It wanted a constitutionally stable franchise that outlives screens, personalities, misinterpretations, media blitz cycles, and celebrity-friendly subject lines. The first twist? They both thought they were playing the same game. One side played PR. The other played climate control. Royal PR is usually a polished artifact, not a powder keg. But when Charles finally confirmed Meghan would never return to working duties, the institution's PR arm shifted from crisis public relations to succession public relations. What's succession PR, you ask? It's PR that quietly sets public expectation for institutional outcomes decades in advance. It's where press strategy meets monarchy strategy meets inevitability strategy meets generational trust adhesives meets emotional narrative burial meets royalty mathematics disguised as messaging. You know when Netflix drops a season teaser? This was season closure disguised as a teaser for history. The palace used early warmth optics to maintain plausible sympathy routes, but it never issued a structural recall. You don't rehire a narrative. You annex it to precedent and bury it by timing. Let's talk about institutional stakes. The monarchy doesn't survive by winning headlines. It survives by outlasting them. Insiders say this draft process hurt, but timing mattered more than tone. Charles needed the announcement to land when Britain was emotionally raw enough to absorb closure without burning empathy, politically stable enough to avoid parliamentary backlash, global enough to matter to Commonwealth audiences, celebrity adjacent enough to bait clicks, but diplomat-insulated enough to avoid brand fracture, and media-tired enough to favor finality over theatrics. This wasn't PR, pals. This was royal calculus and theater makeup. Quick, punchy break. Crowds do emotion. Crowns do endurance. Longer beat. When monarchy faces a brand crossroads, it never negotiates with narrative arsonists. It rewrites future expectation quietly, then utters a single permanent word to sentinel it into history. Let's ask you directly. Why does an institution reject a modernizing celebrity-funded narrative duo now instead of earlier? Answer: not because it's angrier, but because it calculated it wouldn't bleed symbolism doing it today. When reconciliation meets succession mechanics, family apologies bow first. One surprising fact spike. Historically, monarchy has issued verbal closures that seed into precedent soil without requiring immediate paperwork to crystallize institutional exile. Pen ratifies sentences. Precedent ratifies centuries. This announcement was a precedent event disguised as emotional closure messaging. Now let's unpack Harry's reaction contradiction. The palace thought an olive branch message gifted oxygen without future roles. Harry thought oxygen meant a future passport to relevance again. Meghan thought oxygen meant location, cameo, belonging. The monarchy saw oxygen as narrative accelerant that could jeopardize the image of non-negotiable constitutional stability. Harry interpreted warmth optics as role availability. Palace interpreted warmth optics as reconciliation weather, not climate contract negotiation. Harry dreamed of reintegration runway. The monarchy dreamed of brand heat regulation math. You can reintegrate a person. You cannot reintegrate a narrative that competes with institutional perception for decades without first burying its bolts in precedent soil. Another direct audience question for you. Do you hire back weather or seal climate permanently for brand longevity? Monarchy chooses climate every time. Let's paint another scene. A boardroom-style meeting inside palace stone corridors. Gloved palms holding PR drafts. Eyes scanning cadence like audio engineers for generational symbolism. Diplomat advisors who said nothing until they had to approve everything. Celebrities who orbit but never mediate. PR consultants scribbling softer phrases that collapsed into permanence vocabulary by the end. Harry pacing oceans away from the throne room he once thought he was still part of. Meghan believing narratives could rewrite institutions. Charles believing institutions survive even when narratives are louder. The wrong people overhearing the wrong words and understanding the wrong temperature for the wrong reasons. The crown doing math while the media wrote poetry. Rejection being seasonal in emotion but eternal in precedent. The monarchy deciding whether to absorb a feud or bleed symbolism. Timing mattering more than tone. Grammar mattering more than press. System mattering more than storyline. And a prince realizing cadence cracks don't need paperwork to feel permanent. They just need precedent to be spoken aloud. Harry wanted forgiveness. The monarchy needed distance. Meghan wanted continuity arcs. The monarchy wanted narrative burial QR codes historians will decode decades later. In transcript leaks insiders referenced later, aides had warned privately, space is oxygen. It's not office. Harry thought monarchy needed modernization. The monarchy thought modernization needed monarchy-proof clauses. Harry thought reconciliation equal reintegration. Charles knew reintegration equal empathy risk to climate brand if narrative bolts were loosened. Think about that. Warmth gestures were the teaser. Never was the payoff. Harry lost control because the monarchy didn't. That's the real jaw clencher. Do you see how strategic the monarchy is when it does a tragic announcement? The tragedy is for people. The announcement is for history, and the history becomes precedent, and the precedent becomes paperwork without showing you the receipts today. Because the receipts are the announcement itself. Did the palace reject Meghan from a role? Or reject the narrative Harry still thought was loading into their futures? And when monarchy controls climate instead of weather, does reconciliation stand a chance? Or does it bow before first class ends? But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Or maybe the better question is this. When does confidence stop looking like leadership and start looking like entitlement in royal corridors? Because that's the exact pivot point we're dissecting now. Meghan Markle didn't lose a working role because she lacked ability. She lost it because she misunderstood the monarchy's operating system. She thought proximity equaled participation. That titles equaled authorization. That popularity equaled constitutional bargaining chips. That narrative momentum could bend institutional physics. That Hollywood connections could rewrite centuries. That belonging was a storyline that could be socially negotiated and downloaded later when family wounds calmed. She thought the monarchy needed her arc more than it needed its own climate stability. She believed her future role was a doorway ajar, waiting for a triumphant reentry montage. But the institution viewed future access differently, not as an arc, but as a risk factor to be heat-mapped, tested, socially digested, diplomatically cleared, then quietly sealed in precedent soil. Let's break that down a bit sharper. You probably think Meghan imagined her future in speeches, gowns, patronages, tours, celebrity collaboration summits, red carpet humanitarian intersections, media-friendly charity optics, progressive monarchy reinvention headlines. and a slow reconciliation arc where she and Harry would return wearing service crowns instead of ceremonial ones. But monarchy doesn't recruit futures that compete for public symbolism. It recruits futures it can control. Meghan thought she owned the future because she helped shape the narrative. But shaping a narrative isn't owning an institution. It's like designing the trailer to a train you don't drive. The public saw Meghan as an engine of modernization potential, someone who could fuse celebrity reach with institutional patronage and create renewed global relevance. But the palace saw a deeper contradiction underlying that same modernizing idea. The more the monarchy looked like it was hiring from narrative popularity or streaming influence, the more it risked eroding its image of generational inevitability. It had to look stable, not scripted. Immovable, not impressionable. Sovereign, not seasonal. Institutions fear architects who think they're monarchs. They don't crown them. They close doors before they ever touch the throne. Now imagine Meghan's forecasts for patronage reintegration. She thought reconciliation meant selective reintegration into working engagements, negotiating new roles that matched her California brand halo while preserving the royal core. She imagined service partnerships that looked like Hollywood premieres, gloss, visibility, emotional ownership, fashionable philanthropy, curated appearances with curated lines that felt heartfelt and progressive. But the monarchy needed its brand to feel perennial, like climate, not weather. She thought an olive branch was a handshake. The palace treated it like a temperature check. She thought lesser public-facing duties meant a redefined office seat. The monarchy saw them as oxygen for a spark it was no longer prepared to host. And that creates one of the juiciest contradictions we'll pay off later. Harry asked for room. Meghan wanted runway. Charles allowed oxygen. William saw threats. The institution closed futures before they became office geometry. Because space isn't office, just oxygen. And in a monarchy where oxygen catches fire, you don't offer runway. You offer weatherproof glass, precedent fertilizer instead of role renewal. Let's hit your emotional spike receptors for a moment. Harry had hoped for a reconciliation runway. He saw earlier warmth gestures publicly as green lights. Meghan saw them as belonging arcs, fragile but present. But Charles never intended to inject structural roles back into the monarchy workforce chart. Because you can reconcile emotion without recalling a narrative's payroll. That's monarchy grammar. And grammar sets climate, not personas. The palace doesn't ever appoint someone's future based on their confidence in narrative role ownership. It appoints futures that don't compete for constitutional radar or symbolism latitude. Meghan's supporters once thought she'd modernize the monarchy. Critics once thought she'd burn it. But the truth leaked is more subtle. Monarchy doesn't burn futures. It air conditions them until they can't ignite a story, then utters a single word that historians will decode as inevitable closure decades later without needing receipts screamed today. Let's come to the day Meghan believed she saw the future crown seating arrangement for herself. She imagined a role where she would gradually reintegrate into working engagements while balancing her personal celebrity brand geography against institutional boundaries. Think gowns, patronage renewals, progress speeches, diplomatic adjacencies, interviews framed as belonging arcs, public reentry red carpet montages, Netflix-style philanthropy reinvention arcs. She believed reconciliation equaled chairs waiting in corridors. But monarchy chairs are not emotional furniture. They are constitutional fixtures. You don't assign chairs to weather. You assign them to climate. Let me ask you this directly. When someone believes they own a chair they never had permission to design, do you let them sit? Or do you quietly remove the table before broadcast? Charles removed the table. Here's another surprising fact spike. The wording, "never welcomed back into the working royal family," triggered not just media digestion waves, but constitutional finality censors. There are similar precedent vocal closures in monarchy history, phrases uttered not to scold, but to seal. Family closures bow to institutional climate adhesives. And adhesives survive. That's the monarchy's oxygen policy. It's brand glue. And if glue can't hold permanence without ambiguity, it never gets incorporated into changes. It gets archived quietly before public lawyers are called. And that is why this chapter is called The Future Meghan Thought She Owned. She thought reconciliation was a runway. The institution saw it as climate heat risk. Deep breath. Let's talk her perspective first. She had imagined reintegration through what's called public belonging story arcs. Meghan had once said privately through intermediaries that she believed monarchy needed modernization synergy more than narrative outline editors needed lawyers. She was brilliant at narrative, and monarchy analysts admit that brilliance. But monarchy brilliance is only hired if it doesn't compete for constitutional optics ownership. You welcome modernization. You don't welcome architects who misread chairs as runways. If monarchy gives narrative architects a stage, it makes sure climate radar doesn't glitch. Glitching climate leads to dissolving brand trust. Harry notoriously loves narrative arcs. He once interpreted those earlier warmth gestures publicly as structural green lights. Meghan interpreted those same gestures as belonging oxygen. But Charles had to manage what monarchy analysts will call climate regulation more than apology arcs. Because the monarchy had to look perennial, not scripted. It had to ensure the brand didn't look like it was hiring momentary empathy spikes or entertainment proximity for staffing. Staffing decisions don't run on ocean pacing. They run on generational inevitability adhesives. Think of it like this. Harry wanted family formation. Charles had to maintain monarchy grammar. Grammar is climate. Personas are weather. Meghan's earlier warmth attempts were optics frosting, not recall notifications. The institution saw reconciliation attempts as oxygen for gesture moments, not chairs. Chairs require climate adhesives. And that's the truth Harry wasn't prepared to metabolize earlier. Now let's hit an analogy beat because you requested storytelling mechanics for retention. Monarchy is less like a crown, more like a tree older than California coast winds. You don't attach new branches to the trunk if those branches believe they can uproot the tree later. You graft branches that know they are branches, not chainsaws. Meghan believed she could rewrite the bark. The monarchy carved her arc into bark instead. The bark outlives drafts. The bark becomes precedent. The bark becomes paperwork without receipts screamed. The bark is not burned by timing. It is sealed by cadence. Let's insert an emotional pacing spike. Meghan Markle felt publicly rejected by a statement the institution did not want to soften into a maybe. Harry felt personally misled by selective warmth gestures earlier that he misread as structural green lights. Charles felt sadness, but sadness is temporary. Institutional credibility bleed is generational. Generational bleed influences succession stability, Commonwealth loyalty, Republican sentiment pacing, diplomatic relevancy physics, celebrity adjacency heat risk sensors, and the monarchy's image of perennial inevitability. So Charles did the one thing every monarchy custodian historically does when climate must win over reconciliation weather. He uttered permanence in a tone that closed futures without shredding family dignity publicly. But privately? Oh, privately, it detonated narrative starvation in Montecito that day. Harry hoped for forgiveness arcs. Meghan hoped for runway arcs. Charles allowed oxygen for minutes, not payroll for futures. That's monarchy grammar. Grammar sets climate. Now ask yourself, viewer, if you had lost hope not because of rejection, but timing? Which hurts worse? Timing doesn't bruise. It buries. Because bruises fade. Precedent sticks. Let's dig deeper into the institutional decision timeline layered mid-beat. Commonwealth diplomats quietly monitor monarchy pulses when brand fractures or reconciliations trend in streaming pipelines. Celebrity adjacency could braid the story with emotional elasticity that erodes the institution's perennial inevitability optics. The monarchy thinks generationally. Hollywood thinks narratively. The public misreads optics. Monarchies don't want misinterpretation. They want climate. And climate doesn't negotiate with runoff personalities. Another viewer question for retention poll. Do you hire back a narrative architect who imagines chairs instead of runways mid-clause? Or do you lock a statement into precedent soil and let historians decode the why decades later while saving credibility glue today? Glue over gowns. Glue over cameo roles. Glue over metaphors. Glue over maybe. Glue over scripted runways. Monarchy glue is generational climate adhesives. You don't burn it. You set it by cadence. Harry's explosion? Not rage alone. Narrative starvation detonates slower than volcanic shouting. It detonates like a fuse running toward 1,000 years of monarchy flooring, quiet, unseen, unrecorded, reverberating only in future relevant sensors Charles was always responsible to protect. And responsibility always wins over emotion in monarchy operations. Meghan thought future roles were natural outcomes of popularity arcs. Charles knew popularity arcs degrade brand climate if used for staffing. He had to look sovereign, not scripted, enduring, not negotiated, and above influence, not adjacent to streaming rival PR arcs. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Let me ask you this before we even step into the heart of it. How far would you go to rewrite a rejection you never saw loading? Because that's exactly where Harry stood. Emotionally barefoot, narrative pockets turned inside out, pacing the mental margins of a kingdom that had just told him space was a corridor, not an office. The difference between what the public heard and what he felt would form the fault line for everything we're unpacking now. Harry's private plea didn't sound like desperation. It sounded like a prince trying to bargain with destiny in a cathedral built of precedent. Let's open with the human side first. The announcement had barely hit public air before Harry began drafting his own internal monologue response plan. This wasn't social media outrage or a Netflix retort. This was a son staring at a governance climate rejecting the weather he had once believed he could participate in again. He didn't shout. At first, he went silent. And silence in monarchy land isn't empty. It's a draft buffer before detonation. You probably imagine a king's rejection as punctual brutality. But monarchy operates more like glacial grammar. Slow, immutable, polished. And the glaciers don't move because a prince asks politely. They move when climate physics demand it. And climate physics had just demanded never. So Harry did the one thing no royal climate analyst could have predicted cleanly enough to draft proof. He pleaded as a son, not as PR, not as litigation, not as narrative warfare, but as a man who had spotted emotional cracks where William had always spotted climate. Harry once believed selective warmth gestures meant a future runway, but Charles had already sealed the runway geometry into precedent soil. So now what was left? Oxygen. Just oxygen. Harry was breathing it rapidly. The first private plea call attempt post-announcement went out not toward Charles, but toward a trusted intermediary, one of those gray corridor officials who carries messages like emotional subpoenas wearing white gloves. Why intermediaries? Because monarchy negotiations aren't done directly. They are delegated to messengers selected for their loyalty to silence, not headlines. It was a call that connected not to tone reconciliation offices, but to a man who knows monarchy grammar better than he knows heartache. That intermediary later recounted that Harry sounded measured, but movement under his words sounded volcanic. When a man who once inhabited monarchy corridors is told he cannot staff a role again, his plea begins sounding like a man who conflates corridors with futures. Did he scream? No. He whispered. Rapidly. Whispering rapidly is scarier for an institution than shouting loudly. Let's talk about Harry's cadence next. He apparently had practiced what he wanted to say long before press played the clip. He had rehearsed the emotional payload. Acknowledgement, belonging, partial service patronages, boundaries that feel progressive, not punitive, public reentry arcs that allow redemption without representation, charity engagements that look iconic, not conditional, a family that can heal without rewriting the crown's payroll schedule. That was his rehearsal. But the monarchy doesn't hire rehearsals. It hires inevitability. During the intermediary call, Harry said, she was ready to serve again quietly, without representation. He stressed quietly. He said quietly twice. But here's the truth. You can't modulate a word out of royal climate once history hears it. You can only plead about the bolts you think are still in the table, not realizing the table was already removed months earlier behind official hours. Because monarchy displays weather warmth publicly while engineering climate privately. And climate had no plan to staff narrative architects who think they sit in staffing chairs. Let me ask you, viewer, do you think monarchy staffing chairs are offered by empathy or metrics or precedent? And what breaks a prince faster? Firm rejection or ambiguous hope silently never institutionalized into a role contract? Ambiguous hope is a debt. It accumulates interest. Interest explodes slower than screaming, but explodes deeper. Harry continued speaking to the intermediary not for 5 seconds, but long minutes. Long minutes matter, because monarchy counts minutes in cadence metabolism. He stressed emotional contradictions, The public saw exile. He saw possibilities privately. Meghan saw belonging arcs narratively. Charles saw risk factors constitutionally. Harry wanted a redefined version of service. Palace had to reject versions that don't look perennial enough to glue into generational climate grammar. Harry said, "She never wanted to compete with the crown." But the monarchy doesn't ban a wish. It bans interpretations that bleed symbolically. Bleed symbolic loss equals monarchy brand dust. Dust doesn't rehire narrative architects. Dust fertilizes precedent climate soil silently. Then paperwork emerges decades later, not from Meghan's fans or critics, but for inevitability analysts who want monarchy to look perennial. Long marquee reflection pocket 1. You leave a job. The job doesn't equal the institution. The institution equal climate adhesives. Climate adhesives punish narratives that believe they should be chairs. Back in Montecito, Harry reportedly drafted a letter that never went out publicly. It hovered halfway between a plea and a declaration. It had emotional vulnerability spikes, but monarchy interprets vulnerability spikes as narrative accelerant risk if HR recall chairs are implied. So the letter was pitched to intermediaries, then repolished, then returned as a spoken precedent direction that climate analysts say finalizes futures without hiring narrative weather retorts. Charles had allowed earlier warmth optics to maintain plausible audience sympathy lakes, but never gave structural chairs into the workforce chart. And that was the contradiction Harry metabolized wrongly earlier. Let's do pacing change, short line spike. Harry begged. The monarchy archived. But Harry wasn't done begging. He was just done talking loudly. He started talking humanly. Meghan once said privately she wanted a reentry but not a working role. But reentry as presence does not equal reentry as staffing. And Charles needed the monarchy brand climate to frighten Republican sentiment dust from generational adhesives. So he allowed oxygen for minutes, not roles for futures. That is monarchy grammar. Grammar is climate. Personas are weather. The institution does not hire weather. It archives it. Longer explanatory beat. Harry believed reconciliation meant reintegration into working engagements so long as representation of crown was renounced. But the monarchy can't reintegrate a narrative architect to office geometry. Office geometry must look perennial, administrative, constitutional, and above influence. Meghan and Harry left monarchy turf believing they could author their own sequel to a future they thought they still had keys to. But monarchy doesn't recruit futures that compete narratively for constitutional radar symbolism. It recruits futures that bow to climate adhesives. If you wanted to rehire someone into a role, would you say never, publicly, or route it through a quiet communique institutionally? The answer is in the climate grammar. And monarchy grammar always matters more than press poetry. Harry apparently had slammed a door once in his life earlier. But slammed doors echo in rooms. Never echoes in futures. And futures are what they needed to extinguish before news cycles got to Harry's nerve-breaking point. Because nerve-breaking points burn hot, but burn fast. Monarchy's symbolism adhesives punish narrative arcs that conflict with structural climate fixtures that outlive streaming partners or cameo partnership desires. And cameo partnership desires are narrative accelerant nerves. Nerves accelerate stories. The monarchy doesn't want story acceleration. It wants climate adhesives that age like bricks. Bricks are families who know they are families, not institutions. Institutions are families in uniform, but family rifts cannot equal institution fracturing for monarchy brand longevity. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Here's a question that should bother you more than the announcement itself. If you truly intended to say goodbye, why would you rehearse it 12 different ways first? Because farewells are simple. Verdicts are edited. And this was the most edited verdict the monarchy has delivered in the digital age. The palace didn't spend weeks polishing the cruelty out of the statement. They spent weeks polishing the ambiguity out of the future. Every rewrite wasn't tone control. It was climate control. Each draft tightened another bolt on a future Harry still believed was paused, not buried. What the public interpreted as a rejection, the institution engineered as a precedent-setting constitutional full stop disguised as condolences choreography. This chapter unspools the process where a monarchy statement stopped being a press artifact and became the doctrinal weather report for decades of public digestion. It began in a side office that reporters never see, but historians always find later. The drafting team consisted of communications aides, private secretaries, constitutional advisors, brand analysts for the monarchy's longevity optics, and a silent legal subcommittee who waited like referees for words to cross a line Charles didn't even realize existed until the institution pointed a spotlight at it. The first draft reportedly contained softer phrasing that stressed reconciliation corridors, emotional elasticity, conditional belonging signals, limited reintegration possibilities phrased in family-friendly grammar, and a bureaucratically tepid maybe. This version was built not to finalize Meghan's exit, but cushion Harry's dignity. But monarchy dignity doesn't thrive on cushions. It thrives on stone. And stone doesn't flex for Netflix crossovers or ceremonial cameo hopes. It erodes them. A constitutional advisor crossed out conditional language and wrote a note. If you want weather to end, write climate, not forecasts. The second draft added phrases that attempted to hint at boundaries without burying them, but hints are seasonal. Seasons upset historians. And monarchy doesn't want seasonality anymore. It wants continuity, consistency. By draft 4, the tone had shifted into something like polite quarantine, but quarantine isn't exile. It's containment with possibility. And possibility was the exact thing Charles had to deny without sounding like he was denying forgiveness. The word never made its first cameo in draft 7, was removed in 8, quietly slipped back in 9, tightened into institutional certainty by draft 10, and by 11 it wasn't a cameo. It was a mandate. A monarchy mandate doesn't need letters patent if it's uttered with the cadence of generational inevitability. It just needs ears to hear the weight behind it. And the weight was intentional. You probably wonder who pushed the word never into the final statement. Was it Charles deciding in anger? No, he never drafts based on anger. He drafts based on arithmetic wearing empathy makeup for headlines. The internal monarchy franchise analysts say revisions peaked when a draft began sounding too negotiable. Negotiability is a PR garnish the institution didn't trust anymore after